Today is the 14th of July, 2015, and today's topic is Ronald Reagan's policy toward the Soviet Union, we'll say in his first year or two, 1981 to 82. I doubt if we'll get halfway through that, but my guest is Jeff Risner, a city council member, Democratic Party member, also a computer expert who worked in Rio Grande College in computers, and is also an expert on geology. And I am Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University, and this is Athens Speakout number 338. And I have been talking, not with Jeff, but with another colleague of mine by the name of Dave DeWitt, about Ronald Reagan's sweeping election of November 1980, in which he defeated Jimmy Carter and became the 40th president. And I, as an actor, as a critic of actors, as a historian, paid no attention to Ronald Reagan in his early career, and I didn't pay much attention to him in his first couple of years. I thought he was just full of hot air from the very beginning. But in any case, as a historian, I was a fan of Henry Kissinger, who advocated a balance of power foreign policy and had a great influence on Nixon, some influence on Jerry Ford. Well, I guess he even had more influence on Jerry Ford. He dominated the Ford administration 100%. With Nixon, it was a hot and cold game. And then he had some dubious influence on Jimmy Carter and negotiated the truce with Egypt, in which he got Egypt to withdraw from the Sinai. And that became the basis of the Camp David Accord. And Jimmy Carter then had to follow through on that long-delayed treaty. But Ronald Reagan was a great actor and a great shouter of anti-communism. And slogans are not going to be very effective. And I had no illusion that he would have any ideas of what to do once he got into office. But anti-communism had been popular since 1945, and all Ronald Reagan did was to just quote the mass media from 45 through all of the presidents, Democrats and Republicans, and he had a very low understanding of anti-communism. He learned most of it from J. Edgar Hoover. And he graduated from college with a C- average, probably, and majored in sports announcing. And he was a vague Christian. He belonged to the Disciples of Christ, the same denomination that Lyndon Johnson began, a kind of a Calvinistic, rural religion that was popular in rural Illinois where he was raised. And then, because he had a good voice, he went to Hollywood and became an announcer, and he got immediately a job for J. Edgar Hoover in reporting on the Screen Actors Guild, in which he picked up some more information about how evil communism was taking over the world, and then he continued that and really didn't think of running for president or even the governor of California until 1966. Now, in 1966, his political career opens because he went to the Goldwater nomination and went to the convention and saw the fight between Goldwater and the Nelson Rockefeller for president. And he began to raise money for the Goldwater campaign and got to know a lot of politicians. And from that, he said, well, you know, I can go and become the governor of California. I already had all of the speeches. Just keep talking about communism, and you'll get elected. And he did. So anyway, Kissinger, as I say, was a great scholar, and he wrote over a dozen books, was an expert on Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Winston Churchill, corporate power, and Reagan knew very little about the details of what Kissinger had ever accomplished. And first talent of Ronald Reagan was to keep the Christian slogans going. His second talent is that he did have a talent of how to hire good Republicans who knew something about the issues by going to these Republican conventions and talking to the California Republican establishment. So he could pick talent by just keeping his ears open. And he became governor of California in 1966, ran a second term in 1970, and he then was completely in charge, and he won a huge election in 1980, defeating Jimmy Carter, and denouncing him as an appeaser and a wimp, and Ronald Reagan, would launch a second Cold War. Well, I think we're going to ready for Jeff's first question. Can you describe the character of Ronald Reagan's character? Who of some of these talented people he managed to appoint in his very first year, January 1981?
Well, of course, you already mentioned Kissinger.
Well, no, Kissinger was out.
Yeah,
he
okay.
retired.
Yeah, that's right.
And Kissinger, theoretically, was out of the scene because he goes to Georgetown and becomes an academic.
Right, right.
Now, you raised an interesting point. Henry Kissinger probably had some occasional advice to give during the Reagan administration to some of his secretaries. Particularly the CIA, and also the Secretary of State.
Yeah.
I think they picked up some clues. So who was his Secretary of State? Who was his CIA director? And, who was his Chief of Staff? Any of those cabinet people? Do you have any idea? Or
No, I don't.
Do you have any idea?
I'm kind of with a total blank here.
Total blank. Well, legally, the Secretary of State is the most senior official. And when George Washington was president, he had Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State. Now, when Truman became president, he had trouble. He had trouble in finding a Secretary of State. And he had 5 of them. He first had Ambassador Grew.
Yeah.
And then he had Edward Stettinius, who only each one lasted a couple of months. And then he came up with Jimmy Burns, who lasted for 6 months. And then he came up, his 4th Secretary of State, stayed for 2 years and was probably one of the best Secretary of States of all time.
George Marshall.
George C. Marshall. Then Marshall got into a fight with Truman over the Israeli problem in 1948 and said, I'm going to resign whether you win or not. But we have to back up big oil and the British Empire, and Israel is not going to help us as an American citizen. So he resigned, and he came up with his second Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who was a qualified corporate lawyer.
Yeah.
A corporate lawyer, and knew something about foreign policy, and he had worked for the Roosevelt State Department. So he knew the inside of the State Department. All right, well, Ronald Reagan's most important official was not his Secretary of State. I wouldn't call him number one. His number one appointment was General Alexander Haig. And he appointed this general as the Secretary of State. And he only lasted a year, and he got into trouble with the Israelis and Lebanon, and he was quickly had to resign. So I don't think he was one of Ronald Reagan's best picks.
Well, previous to that,
Who was that? Alexander Haig? Do you know anything about him?
well,
Where did he come from?
he was a Vietnam era.
Yeah,
general.
he served in Vietnam.
He also became Supreme Commander of NATO.
Yeah, all right. He had
So,
NATO
Yeah.
activities.
So he was, and I'm not sure, but I believe he became chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Yeah, he became general.
So-
That was all relatively minor.
Well, but
Somehow or
for
other-
a military career,
He had the military, he had the
Right.
basic military.
Okay.
But how did he become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and how was he promoted as just another general to the head general? It was Henry Kissinger.
Ah, that's right.
He was Henry Kissinger's personal military advisor. And most of the people, Nixon had no idea. Well, why did Kissinger appoint him?
Yeah.
He didn't come through the regular chain of command.
So that's how he did
Okay,
it.
and then what happened when Nixon was impeached? And what role did Haig play in that? Do you know?
Well, I've heard rumors that when there was a problem with the military forces when Nixon was resigned. No one was quite sure what the chain of command was going to be. Your commander-in-chief is leaving. A new commander-in-chief has to come in. The vice president at some point will have to take over. So there was some consternation.
Well, Nixon's problem had nothing to do with the Army. His problem was Vietnam.
Right.
And Kissinger got him out of Vietnam. He won the presidency,
Right.
but he didn't win the war in Indochina.
Not by that definition.
And then,
no.
then Kissinger goes to Hanoi and negotiates with Lee Doc-to, and there seemed to be, in the minds of the average Republican, a contradiction between Kissinger and Nixon. And everyone thought that Nixon has won the presidency and he's going to win the war. Well, Watergate.
Yeah.
And that had nothing to do with the Army.
No.
The Watergate problem was a legal problem.
Right. But what's that have to do with Haig, though?
Haig plays a role in that.
In what sense?
Okay.
I mean, Haig.
It was Alexander Haig who goes to Richard Nixon in August of 1974 and said, I have been to the Senate, I have been to the Republican Senate, and I'm bringing you news from the Republican Senate, and this is how he's an agent of Kissinger. He said, you will have to resign because if you go to conviction, you don't have the votes, and the Republican Party will will convict you of high treason and misdemeanors. So it was
Haig.
Haig who delivered the news
I see.
through.
So he was just an errand boy. He was
an errand boy for Kissinger.
Uh-huh.
He said, you have to step down.
Okay.
And he did.
Okay.
And that was
easy.
That was the message of that's how he's important.
And that's how he rose up.
Well, okay. Legally, Ford is the president.
Right.
But he announces, okay, I'm in charge now. And he had a day before Ford took the oath.
That's right.
And then Kissinger carries on with Ford and became the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor.
That's right.
And Haig is still playing a minor role as the military advisor of Henry Kissinger all during the Ford administration.
Okay.
So he's there.
There he is.
Okay.
Okay, he's lurking around.
So now when Jimmy Carter is president, Kissinger goes to Georgetown,
That's right.
gets out of politics, and Haig is playing a low role. Well, now that Ronald Reagan is elected, I believe, I don't have the documents, but I believe Henry Kissinger said to Ronald Reagan, why don't you make Alexander Haig your Secretary of State? And this will be the militarization of the State Department. And we can it's going to be, you're going to have a new Cold War. Okay, well, you're going to have some military credentials.
Right.
And Haig was in charge.
I see.
As Secretary of State.
And now who was National Security Advisor?
Well, that's not as important. Who's the Chief of Staff? I think the Chief of Staff is more important. Do you know who Alexander Haig had as Chief of Staff?
No, I don't.
Well, it has something to do with Texas.
Well, let's see.
Did you ever hear of James Baker III? Who was James Baker III?
Well, if he's the same Baker that George Bush had as
That's
Secretary
right.
of State, I can't tell you anything about his background.
He was a Houston lawyer. He was an expert on the oil business. He got a BA at Harvard. Then he got his law degree at Texas. And he was James Baker III. James Baker II was also an attorney in Houston for all of the oil corporations. This is how the cartel have to get legal contracts, okay?
I see.
And now you remember Governor Conway?
Oh, yeah. He was shot with Kennedy.
Yeah, but he was the governor of Texas. He was a Democrat.
At one time, yes.
Well, he was a Democrat when he was in the car.
Yeah.
And Johnson was the president. And James Baker is also a Democrat. So as Conley moves over to the Republicans,
Right.
Baker is moving over to the Republicans. And who is George Herbert Walker Bush? And how did he come to Texas? And where did he come from?
Well, the Bushes were originally, New Englanders.
Okay.
Okay, so now they're.
But
Old Man Bush made his fortune in Occidental Petroleum.
Now you were talking about Herbert Walker.
Okay.
Now before Herbert Walker,
Okay.
who moved to Texas as a Republican in a Democratic state, and he went there right after law school in 1948. And he was an oddball by going to Texas. But Prescott Bush, who was his father, was a Wall Street attorney who lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, and was the senator from Connecticut, but made all of his money in Wall Street. So the young George Herbert Walker Bush says, "Well, I have a plush thing in Wall Street. I can already take over the firm."
Yeah.
But he says, "I want to be an enterprise. I want to be my own man, and I understand that oil is going to be the future. So I'm going down to Texas,
Yeah.
and I'll see how the oil business runs, and I'll be a millionaire." And he was a millionaire by age 40 in the oil business. Now that's how Occidental Petroleum gets in there.
You know where their oil fields were? Occidental?
Well, yeah, where are they?
Libya.
Okay.
Not Saudi Arabia, not Iraq,
Okay.
but Libya, North Africa. That's where he made his big
Okay.
strike, because everybody knew there was no oil there.
I see.
And he was,
Did you actually meet Bush in Occidental?
no, but I met the people that used to work for him.
Ah, okay.
The old Occidental Petroleum Company was still limping along there.
Right.
Okay. So some of the original hands and people who went in there and found the oil and started developing it, they knew him. They talked about him, and how the whole thing was just one huge gamble.
Yeah.
If they hadn't drilled another 10 feet, it would have been a bust. He would have
Right.
been bankrupt.
He was lucky.
We would never have heard of him. It would all disappeared.
I see.
But he hit, and he hit extremely big.
Right.
And Occidental Petroleum then started developing the oil fields in Libya under old King Idris before Gaddafi came in.
That's a part
Yeah.
I never knew.
So Idris.
That's your geological
Yeah.
background.
Right. So that's how. Yeah.
You always have something to learn if you keep discussing politics.
That's right. Yeah. So that's how our George.
Herbert Walker. We're talking about George.
Herbert Walker Bush then
Right.
gets this huge financial influx.
Right.
Wall Street's great, okay, but there's just nothing like oil that's just endless.
Right.
And the other thing about the Libyan oil was, it is prime oil. It's sweet, crude. There's almost no salt in it.
Right.
So it takes very little refining, and so it commands an
Now that's sold as city service in the United States, right?
city services. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
A
later
little,
became-
little green sign.
Yeah, that's right.
I guess they've consolidated now. They're gone.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think the Venezuela Oil Company eventually bought them all out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, well, anyway, go on to what you're talking about.
Okay, so when did you leave Libya now? What date?
Oh, let's see, it'd been summer of '76.
Oh, 76. Well, let's go back 10 years before, in 66. In 1966, James Baker III, as a Houston oil attorney, who must have given George Bush, well, here are clues. Why don't you try Continental? And you might strike it rich.
Yeah.
But anyway, Bush was learning the financial structure in Texas, in Houston, okay,
Yeah.
through the advice of, and then when Bush had $1 million from this Occidental, I guess, Baker says to Bush, why don't you run as a Republican to the House of Representatives? And he won in 1966. That's the beginning of the political George W.
Right.
Bush. And then he was reelected 2 years later, 68,
Yep.
and then he was reelected in 70. Now, in 70, he says, I don't want to run again. He gets a job with Nixon. He goes into the Nixon White House. And Nixon appoints him as the chairman of the Republican Party on a national scale. Because Nixon was now deep into the Watergate thing. And he had to have an honest, and that's one thing we can say about George W. Bush. He did learn a degree of honesty from Prescott Bush and his mother and old Episcopalian family.
Right.
So he came from the New England elite. And Nixon says, well, I can trust this guy to be a neutral in the National Committee.
Sure.
And he served there for about 2 years. And then the speculator, he gets appointed when China is recognized. He's sent as an envoy to China.
Right.
On the ground floor and gets to know something about the Chinese business. So George W. Bush was ambitious
Oh yeah.
to go beyond Prescott Bush. Okay.
Yeah.
So Baker and Bush are building their careers together, politically and economically.
Right.
Okay. Well, then I better look at my notes and see where we are.
Well, that's a very interesting digression.
Well, it isn't a digression. Well, anyway, we're up to 66, and then into the Nixon administration, we're up to 70. Now, Carter's election in 76, both Baker and Bush have a kind of a ceiling.
That's right.
They're not going to be promoted. But see now, this is where Baker is shrewd as a politician. In 1972, before Nixon won the election, he says, well, Nixon's in trouble over Vietnam. And whether he gets elected or not, he's going to be in trouble. He knew something about that Watergate scandal. He knew that Nixon was a crook.
Okay.
Okay, and he said he's in trouble. So Watergate, these people were just, and Nixon, well, let's say Bush and James Baker are watching where the leaves fall. And actually, Baker met Bush through his wife, George Bush's wife.
Oh, I see. Barbara.
Barbara Bush went to Washington as a secretary, and Bush was down there trying to get into the Congress, and he meets the wife of Baker.
Okay.
And she says, well, you look up James Baker when you get back to Texas. And that's how they
I'll be
consolidate.
darned.
That's how Bush was introduced personally to James Baker.
Well,
anyway, Ronald Reagan was elected as the 40th president in 1981. And through Kissinger, Alexander Haig is made the Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
But James Baker was in charge of the rest of the cabinet.
I see.
You know, he knew
He's
where.
the chief of staff.
Yeah, he knew Caspar Weinberger and who the CIA was, CIA. So he is key.
Right.
And then, of course, after Reagan retires,
Mm-hmm.
Baker goes on with the Bush presidencies
Mm-hmm. Right.
and was vital in that 2000 election and got.
Oh, right.
That went right, and he's still power there but for the Republicans and not. So James Baker is the third, is the chief of staff, and Baker. This is an interesting thing. Baker was born in April of 1930.
Okay.
He is now 85 years old. He was born 2 weeks before I was, and my birthday is the 16th of May, 1930.
Okay.
So I can psychologically know just where James Baker is coming from. But of course, he had money, and I had to
Well, there you go.
work on the outside. but I could get the dates straight. So anyway, Baker becomes the chief of staff for Herbert Walker Bush when Herbert Walker Bush becomes the governor of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a steady continuity there. And Herbert Walker Bush, Connecticut, came from Connecticut, but he's going through the Texas so-called carpetbagger rules, and he's becoming powerful. And George W. Bush then got reelected in 1968, got a job with Nixon, and Herbert Walker then went to Yale. We've already got that background. I'm just kind of catching up my notes. And Baker III predicted Nixon would lose. And in 1980, the governor of Texas and Ronald Reagan from California, they make an alliance. What a powerful thing in 1981. The head of the oil business from Texas and the Hollywood TV expert from California. California and Texas, that is a powerful coalition financially. Even though Ronald Reagan doesn't know anything about the Soviet Union, he can still spout anti-communism. So anyway, that's the thing that makes the Republican dynasty very, very powerful. And Reagan was the master of TV. Okay, we can talk about a third personality. Who's George Shultz?
Well, George Shultz was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State.
After Haig resigned.
After Haig, yeah.
Haig didn't last.
No.
He got into trouble in Lebanon,
That's right.
and George Shultz is the,
Well, yeah.
and he stays right to the end of the administration.
That's right. Yeah.
So Ronald Reagan came up with a good, I don't think Ronald Reagan thought, I think it's Henry Kissinger, who said, okay, Haig's out, take George Shultz.
Right.
Now, what was George Shultz's financial background? Where did he come from? Where did he get his money?
I don't know. Where did he come from?
You heard of the Bechtel Corporation?
Oh, you bet. Yeah.
What is the Bechtel Corporation?
Oh, Bechtel Corporation is one of the largest transnational construction companies in the world.
It competes with Halliburton.
Right.
And they're in San Francisco. And there was already a Bechtel Corporation guy in the cabinet. There were two of them. George Shultz, and who was the Secretary of Defense.
Cap Weinberger.
He was also from Bechtel. So the Bechtel Corporation is into the military-industrial complex, and they built air bases and sea bases,
Yeah.
And there goes Eisenhower's.
Rebuilt Kuwait,
Yes.
everything.
So oil and the military are all in this interlocking directorate,
Mm-hmm.
and they're building the plutocratic Republican Party from
Yeah.
Texas and
Right.
California.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a powerful cabinet. Even though Ronald Reagan
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
gave a 2-minute speech every day by walking to the
Yeah.
television and saying, hello, hi. He had to get up at 2
Now,
o'clock in the afternoon.
Was it Haig's, was it really Haig's idea to land the Marines into Beirut and then have them all killed?
Well, I don't think it was his idea. The important thing is Begin. Who is Menachem Begin? He's the guy who makes the next move.
Yeah, but Menachem Begin didn't blow up the Marines at their base. I mean,
No.
over 200 Marines were killed.
But why were the Marines in Beirut?
Well, that's a good question. And that's something I have never been able to figure out, because I remember when we invaded Lebanon. Of course, Lebanon had been in a civil war since 1976, 75, 76.
Yeah, Lebanon was in a civil war.
Right. Now, why we intervened, I've never really fully understood.
Okay. Well, there were 5 Arab-Israeli wars.
Yeah,
Okay. The first one was 1948 under Truman,
right,
and that's when Israel gets its
right.
independence.
Then there's 56.
56
Suez
was
Canal.
Eisenhower.
Right,
That was a scratch because Israel doesn't get any territory,
no,
and they have to retreat.
right,
And all of the Jews who were sympathetic to Israel vote against Eisenhower and for Kennedy.
mm-hmm,
Okay?
yeah,
So Israel is the #1 important interest in the United States ever since 1948. No president has ever gone up against Israel.
mm-hmm,
Eisenhower was the first critic.
yeah,
The second critic was Jimmy Carter.
mm-hmm,
Now, Jimmy Carter was defeated by Ronald Reagan,
right.
and Ronald Reagan comes in there.
Sure, but it was more than just the Jewish vote that beat Jimmy in
Well,
70,
Jimmy Carter,
80.
okay, well, let's go back to what Jimmy Carter tried to do. Jimmy Carter was a liberal Baptist from Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And Jimmy Carter got the Democratic nomination because of the failure of McGovern in '72.
Mm-hmm.
McGovern was an open dove,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And McGovern lost 49 states,
Yeah.
okay? Took Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Democratic primary, the Democrats moved to the right.
Mm-hmm.
And I never heard of Jimmy Carter. I was for Frank Church from Idaho.
yeah,
I
Frank
know,
Church,
you know,
sure.
and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
But when I came to Athens, Athens was the center of the Ohio nomination process.
Mm-hmm.
They nominated delegates under McGovern's rules from each congressional district. So Athens was the center of it. So there were people from Lancaster and Ironton and Marietta who came there,
Mm-hmm.
and they could caucus. So I went to I went to the church caucus.
Mm-hmm.
About 12 people there. But down in Morton Hall, they had we got 5 minutes. Down in Morton Hall, they had the Jimmy Carter caucus.
Mm-hmm.
Hundreds of people there.
Wow.
They knew he was going to be the winner
Mm-hmm.
because he was going to unite. See, he came across as the Southern liberal.
Mm-hmm.
He had promoted blacks.
Uh-huh.
He had defeated Maddox.
Yep.
He was for civil rights.
Yep.
He had nuclear energy back. He worked for Admiral Rickover.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
So he's making a conservative Democrat, but he's going to win the election, and he did.
Mm-hmm.
But because of Vietnam, when Carter gets into office, amnesty. Forget Vietnam, it's over.
Mm-hmm.
He believes in détente.
Yeah.
Détente with Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
Détente with
Russia. Yeah.
Russia.
Uh-huh.
And he's going to be a pacifist president. And furthermore, as a sincere Christian, since he knew the Bible, he thought, and this was his big error, he thought he knew how to negotiate with Jews in America and in Israel. So he suggests that we'll have a Camp David Accord
Right.
following Kissinger. And Camp David will get Menachem Begin to sign a peace treaty. Menachem Begin signed it, but he was a crook. The day he signed that, he went back to Tel Aviv and he said, I don't believe a word of that document. And I'm going to plan the 5th Arab-Israeli War. And that happened in '82.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So Menachem Begin is the next guy who moves. And he decided to get rid of the PLO,
Yeah.
invade Lebanon and Syria, and we'll have to stop with that point.
Okay.
And you have 2 or 3 minutes to summarize how far we've gotten and how the United States Marines got involved in Beirut. They got into Beirut by trying to get Begin out of the disastrous war because he was losing that 5th war.
Yes.
And he resigned in disgrace. And of course, the Reagan administration helped him to get out of it.
Right.
And we'll have to continue there. Okay,
that's a good
so
point.
you give your summary of what we tried to say in our short show.
Yes, this is a short one due to storms and floods and things.
Yeah.
Well, I think what we're doing here is we're laying the foundation for the Reagan administration as they're moving, as it begins, and how that's going to affect the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Because there's going to be a lot of things that's going to be happening during the Reagan years.
Right.
We're going to have the Solidarity movement in Poland. We're going to have Zbigniew Brzezinski, Pope John Paul II.
That's right. That's the next step.
Both very active Poles who will be instigating, pushing the governments in Eastern Europe.
Right.
And all part of a plan that once you start chipping away at the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union will collapse. It will go. So I think that's where we're laying this down.
Okay.
So
James Baker was vital.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
Haig was an incidental transition.
Yeah. The only thing I really remember about Haig was during the Falklands War when he came out in favor of the British, Margaret Thatcher. So.
Okay, well, thank you for coming.
Okay.
This show is called Debate is the Oxygen of Democracy, and Jeff Risner is one of my favorite debaters.